He thought he could play cop and break into our home. But impersonating security in an FBI family? That's a federal mistake he won't live down. The neighborhood had always prided itself on being quiet, orderly, and just the right amount of nosy. Most residents knew each other by name, waved politely while walking their dogs, and paid their HOA dues on time. So when a new HOA security officer began patrolling the community, few thought to question it. He wore a standard-looking uniform, navy blue shirt, utility belt, black boots, and cruised slowly down the streets in a white SUV with a magnetic decal that read, Neighborhood Safety Patrol. It all looked official enough. He introduced himself as Officer Dale, claiming he was recently hired by the HOA to tighten up security after a few car break-ins were reported the month prior. He carried a clipboard, always seemed to be taking notes, and maintained an unusually intense level of eye contact during every conversation. Most homeowners didn't think twice until his patrols became more frequent and far more invasive. Within the first week, Dale's presence doubled. Instead of a casual morning and evening drive-through, he started circling the blocks multiple times a day. He'd stop his SUV in front of homes and sit there for extended periods, sometimes rolling down his window and watching people with dark sunglasses and an unsettling grin. He began walking up to porches to inspect doorbell cameras, left unsolicited citations on cars parked slightly over the line, and once asked a teenage boy if the bike in his front yard was legally registered. At first, neighbors found him quirky, maybe even helpful. One woman mentioned she appreciated having someone keeping an eye out for package thieves. Another man joked that Dale was like a poor man's RoboCop. But then came the questions. Dale didn't just observe. He pried. He asked residents if their homes had security systems, what brand of cameras they used, and how many people lived in each house. He once asked a retired couple whether they'd be home during the upcoming long weekend. When they answered no, he responded with, "Good to know. I'll make sure to keep a close eye on things." It was phrased like a promise, but it sounded like a threat. He began taking photographs, lots of them. Not of speeding cars or suspicious activity, but of homes, backyards, license plates, and sometimes even people. One family noticed him photographing their children's trampoline and swing set from the sidewalk. When asked what he was doing, Dale claimed he was documenting code violations for the HOA records. But the HOA's official security policies didn't mention any such documentation process, nor had the board notified anyone of a new hire. Still, people didn't want to be the first to accuse him of wrongdoing. Confrontation wasn't in their nature, and as far as most could tell, Dale hadn't broken any laws. But something about him simply didn't sit right. It wasn't just his questions or his camera, it was the way he lingered, how he seemed to study homes more than protect them. One resident swore she saw him walk to the side of a house and peek over the fence late at night, but by the time she looked again, he was gone. Conversations in the neighborhood group chat turned from casual mentions to concerned speculation. Was he really hired by the HOA? If so, why hadn't anyone seen an announcement in the newsletter or on the website? Why was he alone? Most HOA security teams worked in pairs and used clearly marked vehicles. Dale's SUV didn't have plates. That matched the local fleet, and nobody could recall seeing him clock in or out of any nearby guard station. A few neighbors began digging. A phone call to the HOA office confirmed there was no record of a security guard named Dale. In fact, the HOA hadn't hired private security in over 2 years, preferring to work directly with the local police department for any safety concerns. That raised alarm bells. If Dale wasn't sanctioned, who was he? And what was he doing with all the personal information he was collecting? One couple, both of whom worked in federal law enforcement, took particular notice. Their instincts told them something was wrong from day one. There was something too polished, too deliberate about Dale's routine. His uniform didn't match any known security contractor they'd worked with, and the way he handled his clipboard and spoke in rehearsed lines reminded them of someone trying too hard to look legitimate. They didn't show it. But every word, every interaction with Dale was cataloged and scrutinized. The questions he asked weren't those of a concerned guard. They were the probing of someone scouting for vulnerabilities. The couple didn't just see a nosy impersonator, they saw a threat in disguise. The situation now had a different weight to it. This wasn't a quirky neighbor or an overeager volunteer. This was someone embedded in the community collecting sensitive data under false pretenses, and nobody yet knew just how far he was willing to go. Over the next few days, the man known as Officer Dale began shedding the careful mask of subtlety he had worn since arriving in the neighborhood. No longer content with patrolling from a distance, he escalated his activities under the pretense of authority. Residents began reporting unprompted door knocks well past acceptable hours, some as late as 11 p.m. He claimed to be conducting surprise compliance checks for unauthorized visitors, late-night gatherings, and improper porch lighting. These were not part of any HOA protocol, but his presentation remained just professional enough to suppress suspicion. Several homeowners found warning slips left on their mailboxes and windshields, unofficial-looking citations typed on plain paper citing invented infractions such as unapproved lawn decor or inadequate side yard lighting. The documents bore no HOA letterhead or contact information, only the vague signature. Community Enforcement Division. Some neighbors laughed it off, others complied to avoid trouble, but none could find any record of such a department. In the HOA bylaws or local municipal codes, soon the humor wore off. Dale began walking directly onto private property without permission. He stepped into backyards under the guise of fence inspections and tapped on basement windows, claiming to check for proper insulation regulations. When confronted, he confidently stated he had jurisdiction as a designated HOA officer, though he refused to provide identification beyond a badge that was suspiciously generic. His intimidation tactics grew stronger. Homeowners were now reluctant to question him directly, fearing reprisal or fines that they didn't fully understand. Then came the incident that changed everything. One quiet afternoon, a home on the corner, known to be occupied by a family with a teenage daughter, was breached. The front door was discovered wide open by a neighbor returning from a jog. There were no signs of forced entry, no shattered glass, and no alarms blaring, yet the house bore undeniable evidence of intrusion. Drawers had been rummaged through, a laptop and personal files were missing, and kitchen cabinets had been left ajar as though someone had been searching for something. The family's internal security system had captured everything. The footage showed Dale walking briskly toward the front door, dressed in his usual uniform and carrying a small black duffel bag. He paused at the entrance, pulled on latex gloves, and removed a small tool set from the bag. The lock was picked in under a minute. He then entered swiftly, shutting the door behind him. Throughout the video, he moved with familiarity and intent, methodically opening cabinets, checking under cushions, and photographing documents. This was not a random act of theft. It was targeted reconnaissance. What made the footage more disturbing was that the family's teenage daughter had been home during the break-in. She was supposed to be alone for only a few hours after school, with both parents scheduled to return later in the evening. When she heard the front door open, she initially assumed it was one of them. But unfamiliar footsteps and the rustling of drawers quickly triggered her instincts. The security system's audio picked up her whisper as she called her parents from the upstairs closet where she hid, clutching her phone with trembling hands. Thankfully, the man never discovered her presence. He focused entirely on the main floor, stayed less than 10 minutes, and left in the same composed manner he entered, carefully wiping down the doorknob with a cloth on his way out. The daughter remained hidden until her parents arrived, and by the time local law enforcement responded, Dale had already vanished. News of the break-in spread rapidly through the neighborhood, and panic quickly replaced previous unease. The idea that someone pretending to be an HOA guard could enter a home undetected in broad daylight while a child was inside ignited a fury among residents. Trust, already fragile, disintegrated completely. In response, the HOA was inundated with demands for answers. Phone lines were flooded, emergency board meetings were called, and a wave of residents began reviewing their own security footage for signs of similar intrusion. The HOA, still unaware of who Dale was or how he had infiltrated the community, issued a public statement. No new security personnel had been hired, no community enforcement division existed, and no resident should grant access to any individual, claiming to represent the HOA without official documentation. Meanwhile, other alarming details came to light. Several homeowners reported missing items, small electronics, confidential mail, and even spare keys that they had previously dismissed as misplacement. With new context, the pattern became disturbingly clear. Dale had been conducting a series of low-level burglaries, disguised as neighborhood inspections, and no one had noticed until it was nearly too late. This was no longer about fake citations or unnerving questions. This was a coordinated breach, a violation of personal safety, and the terrifying realization that the man posing as a security officer had been preparing for something far more dangerous than mere intimidation. The line had been crossed. Now, it was time for someone to draw one back. Once the break-in was confirmed and the footage reviewed, the situation shifted from neighborhood nuisance to a federal-level threat. Unbeknownst to most of the community, 2 of the residents targeted by the imposter were active-duty FBI agents. They had maintained a low profile for years, blending in with suburban life and rarely disclosing their true professions outside. Official necessity. However, the man posing as an HOA security guard had unknowingly provoked the attention of the last people anyone with criminal intent should ever cross. What might have prompted a confrontation or heated argument in a normal neighborhood instead triggered a calculated, methodical response. The couple understood that escalation without evidence would only give the imposter time to disappear or change tactics. Direct confrontation was off the table. The objective was simple: build an airtight case and remove him with the full weight of federal authority. The process began with internal documentation. The family's home security footage was carefully analyzed, not just for the break-in, but for previous visits where the suspect had loitered near the property. Multiple stills were extracted showing the man's face, his fake badge, and the tools he carried. Every movement was time-stamped and logged. The video captured his license plate number as he drove away, which was cross-referenced with law enforcement databases. Unsurprisingly, the plate didn't belong to any known private security firm or HOA contractor. In fact, it traced back to a vehicle reported stolen 3 months earlier in a neighboring county. Next, physical evidence was collected and preserved. A partial fingerprint lifted from the mailbox citation was analyzed and matched against national criminal databases. It triggered a hit. The man had a record. His real name was not Dale. He had prior arrests for burglary, identity theft, and impersonating public officials, though each time he had served minimal jail time due to insufficient prosecution or legal technicalities. This time, the situation was different. His actions had crossed into federal jurisdiction. The fake uniform was scrutinized in detail. The badge he wore was purchased from a novelty surplus site known for selling knockoff security gear. His identification card was entirely fabricated, laminated at home with poorly aligned text and a logo copied from a now-defunct HOA in another state. The level of detail he invested in his disguise showed planning and intent to deceive, which would bolster charges of impersonation and fraud in court. While collecting this evidence, the agents quietly looped in a small circle of trusted federal colleagues. There was no room for leaks, no tolerance for delays. A coordinated sting operation began to take shape. The agents prepared a full intelligence brief, surveillance photos, criminal history, and behavioral patterns, all of which painted a picture of a calculated repeat offender who had now targeted a federal family. The case was elevated, and the appropriate departments were activated. Criminal impersonation, interstate property crime, and unauthorized access to protected personal information. The goal was not simply to arrest him, but to ensure the charges were inescapable, permanent, and escalated. Each act, posing as an officer, entering homes, gathering sensitive information, stalking residents, was now viewed through the lens of criminal conspiracy and malicious intent. Every violation was cataloged and tied to federal statutes. No assumption was made without verification. Everything needed to be irrefutable. A controlled environment was chosen for the sting. A house within the neighborhood was temporarily vacated and staged to appear occupied but vulnerable. Porch lights on timers, packages left in view, a visible spare key placed under a potted plant, and windows left slightly ajar. Cameras were installed both outside and within, hidden in plain sight but capturing every angle of approach. The suspect's past behavior made the bait nearly irresistible. He had demonstrated a pattern of targeting homes he believed were empty or easy to access. Agents in plain clothes maintained discreet surveillance around the neighborhood, operating in unmarked vehicles and rotating shifts to avoid detection. A single command vehicle stationed several blocks away served as the operations base, complete with real-time video feeds and direct lines to local law enforcement for immediate response. In the days leading up to the trap, the suspect was seen circling the block, slowing down near the decoy house, occasionally stepping out of his SUV to look around. He appeared cautious but interested, exactly what the agents anticipated. All signs pointed to him preparing another unauthorized entry. The sting was nearly ready. All evidence collected thus far had been submitted and reviewed. Warrants were approved, surveillance authorization granted, and the suspect's communications and vehicle activity were being monitored. There would be no room for him to claim mistaken identity or ignorance this time. His actions were part of a deliberate campaign of deception and intrusion. The moment he stepped onto the decoy property, the final phase of the plan would unfold. The imposter had spent weeks pretending to enforce rules he didn't understand. What he failed to realize was that the real rule enforcers had been quietly watching, documenting, and preparing to end his game in a way he never saw coming. With every detail finalized and the groundwork firmly in place, the operation transitioned into its most critical phase: execution. The goal was not just to catch the fake guard red-handed, but to document his intent, his method, and his impersonation beyond reasonable doubt. The trap had to be so compelling that even a seasoned manipulator like him couldn't resist taking the bait. The agents chose a home that had been temporarily vacated for renovation, perfectly positioned within the suspect's known patrol loop. It was well kept on the outside, giving the illusion of occupancy, but carefully staged to appear subtly vulnerable. A few strategic cues were arranged to attract someone looking for an easy target: a pair of packages left on the porch, one of them half torn as if forgotten mid-delivery, a light on in the living room during the day, curtains slightly drawn with just enough visibility to suggest no movement inside. To add an irresistible layer of temptation, a fake HOA notice was posted on the front door, carefully worded to imply the property might be in violation due to extended vacancy, signaling that no one had been inside in weeks. This was designed to suggest a lack of oversight, exactly the kind of weakness someone like the suspect would interpret as an open opportunity. Inside, the home was wired for surveillance. Cameras were mounted discreetly in corners, inside smoke, detectors, and even disguised as everyday appliances. The audio feed was monitored live, and motion alerts were rigged to trigger silently. Every entry point was tracked. Each step he took would be logged and time-stamped. In addition to the video evidence, the agents planted specific decoy valuables, documents with fabricated sensitive information, a mock lockbox under a bed, and props designed to mimic expensive electronics. Touch-sensitive powder on key surfaces ensured that forensic teams could later match his fingerprints without ambiguity. Outside, the surveillance team maintained a rotation of agents in unmarked vehicles, monitoring the suspect's movements in real time. The white SUV with the magnetic Neighborhood Safety Patrol sign had become predictable. He always drove at the same speed, taking the same turns, slowing down near the same houses. It wasn't long before he noticed the decoy home. True to his established pattern, he began by pausing in front of the property for several minutes during his midday patrol. He glanced repeatedly at the porch, the packages, the blinds. He made no attempt to exit the vehicle but scribbled something in his clipboard and drove away. It was a test run, part of his reconnaissance process. The next day, he returned and parked further down the street. This time, he exited the SUV and casually walked by, glancing sideways, pretending to check mailbox numbers. He even knocked on a neighbor's door 2 houses down to maintain his cover, claiming to be investigating a recent noise complaint. The following afternoon, as expected, he made his move, dressed in his faux security uniform, complete with the knockoff badge. He approached the property on foot. He scanned the street for activity, unaware that every move was being broadcast live to a command center a block away. With practiced efficiency, he produced his lockpicking tools and knelt by the front door. It took him less than 30 seconds to bypass the lock. Once inside, he closed the door behind him and began his usual pattern. Quick glance around, focus on drawers, packages, and unsecured items. He checked under rugs, peeked into closets, and opened cabinets. When he discovered the mock lockbox under the bed, he retrieved tools from his duffel bag and attempted to pry it open. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned. His fingerprints, his tools, his voice captured by the microphones. He spoke to himself as he moved, muttering notes and narrating thoughts, unaware that his every word was being recorded. At the pre-designated signal, triggered when he opened the planted folder of sensitive financial documents, the agents made their move. A silent alert was sent, and the backup team on standby closed in. Agents emerged from multiple positions, unmarked vehicles, side yards, and concealed locations around the perimeter. The house was surrounded within seconds. The suspect had no time to flee. A loud command was issued through a speaker system built into the security setup, ordering him to freeze. Simultaneously, the door burst open and trained agents moved in with precision. He froze mid-motion, stunned and speechless. He raised his hands as instructed, completely overwhelmed by the sudden shift in control. Gone was the smug confidence he had maintained for weeks. He didn't speak, didn't argue. He understood instantly that this was no neighborhood watch confrontation. This was the real thing. On the spot, he was handcuffed, searched, and read his rights. His duffel bag, tools, phone, and fake documents were seized. Everything about his operation, from the uniform to the vehicle, was photographed and cataloged as evidence. The agents didn't just arrest him. They dismantled his entire act in front of him, piece by piece. The neighborhood watched from a distance, unaware of the full scope, but immediately grasping the significance. The man who had patrolled their streets, handed out warnings, and inspected their homes wasn't just a fraud. He was a threat neutralized by professionals who had remained hidden in plain sight. What he thought was control was never more than tolerated indulgence by those who knew exactly how to bring him down. With the arrest complete and the imposter in custody, the full weight of the law began to bear down on him. Federal agents processed him through the proper channels, and every piece of evidence, video surveillance, fingerprints, stolen property, forged documents, and impersonation tools, was presented to a federal prosecutor. What had begun as a bizarre case of impersonation was now formally reclassified as a multi-felony investigation with national implications. Charges were filed swiftly and comprehensively. He was booked under multiple federal and state laws, including impersonating a law enforcement official, unlawful entry, possession of burglary tools, identity fraud, wire fraud, and criminal stalking. Each charge carried serious penalties. But, beyond the stack of violations, what made his case particularly egregious was the calculated nature of his deception. He didn't just impersonate authority. He exploited people's trust, using a fabricated position to gain access to their homes, gather personal data, and manipulate the psychology of fear and compliance. Further investigation into his background revealed that this wasn't his first attempt at deception. The man had a long criminal record spanning 3 states, past aliases, sealed court documents, and a string of dismissed charges came to light. He had previously posed as a building inspector, a utility worker, and even a community health officer, all to gain access to homes and commit thefts under the radar. Each time, his strategy was the same: manufacture legitimacy, study routines, and strike when the opportunity appeared most defenseless. This time, however, he had underestimated his surroundings and his victims. His mistake wasn't just entering a neighborhood under false pretenses. It was targeting a household with federal agents trained to recognize manipulation, deception, and surveillance tactics. By the time he was taken into custody, the agents had built a bulletproof case against him, methodically, patiently, and without a single legal misstep. His rights were respected, his arrest properly documented, and the evidence chain meticulously maintained. The court proceedings moved quickly, aided by overwhelming evidence and public interest. The judge denied bail, citing him as a flight risk and a danger to the community. When the full list of his offenses was read aloud in court, even seasoned reporters covering the trial noted the disturbing level of premeditation. Prosecutors emphasized how close he had come to endangering not only property, but human life, particularly the incident involving the teenage girl who had hidden upstairs during the break-in. During sentencing, there was no sympathy shown. He received multiple consecutive sentences for federal impersonation, burglary, and unlawful surveillance. The impersonation of a law enforcement figure alone, under a federal statute, carried a heavy penalty. In total, his sentence amounted to over 30 years with no possibility of parole for the first 2 decades. His career as a con man ended in one cold, final judgment. He had used a fake badge to gain power over others, and now he would spend the prime of his life without any freedom at all. In the neighborhood, the shock began to wear off, replaced by relief and an uneasy sense of closure. Residents came together for a community town hall to discuss what had happened, how it had happened, and how they could prevent anything like it from recurring. The HOA, which had unknowingly been used as the backdrop for his scheme, implemented new protocols. No one would be allowed to represent the association in any capacity without written and verifiable documentation. Security systems were upgraded, neighborhood watch efforts were revived, and communication between residents was more active than ever. But perhaps the most impactful outcome was awareness. The neighborhood had collectively learned how easily fear and compliance could be manipulated by someone wearing a uniform and speaking with confidence. People became more discerning, more vocal, and less willing to accept authority without verification. Parents taught their kids to always double-check who was at the door. Retirees learned how to validate credentials, and the community, once passive and trusting, had become alert and unified. As for the FBI agents who had lived quietly among them, they resumed their normal routines without fanfare. They didn't seek recognition or public praise, but those who knew the full story, those who had watched their quiet precision, their unwavering discipline, and their commitment to doing things by the book, understood what had really happened. A predator walked into their world, thinking he could outsmart a suburban neighborhood. Instead, he stumbled into a federal sting operation he never saw coming. In the end, the story spread far beyond the neighborhood. News outlets covered it as a cautionary tale about deception in plain sight. Security blogs analyzed his tactics. Law enforcement agencies used the case as a training example, and across the internet, a simple message echoed again and again. He wore a fake badge to feel powerful. But he messed with the wrong family. The FBI doesn't tolerate wannabes. If you enjoyed this wild ride, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more jaw-dropping tales. Stay tuned to the HOA stories, where karma always knocks twice.